John, Morgan, good to see you both. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, John.
Great to be here.
Yeah, well, I kind of was thinking about this conversation in three ways. The people that make up the military, the procurement, i.e. the stuff, and then the policies. And so I want to just start with the people, because I think that has a lot to do with, that's what makes us the greatest fighting force in the world is our people. Let me just start with you, John. You in your book, you talk a lot about this, and we'll get into some of the things from your book. But what do you think this new Trump administration needs to kind of start with in terms of the people? What is the message to the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, the Marines, and actually even the civilians and the contractors? What does that signal need to be to them that's different from where it is now?
Well, Sean, once again, thanks for having us on. Real quick and we'll have a discussion about this because I know we're going to cover a bunch of topics, but in terms of the immediate priority for the administration here, in my view, pardon me, it's about reestablishing the mission that we have, which is to win wars, as opposed to having a social experiment, which is something that's been going on for the last 4 years, where if you look at overall recruitment among, let's just take white male recruiting, and that has been, as everyone knows, that's been a cornerstone of people who are deployed, infantry and others, that the white male recruiting has gone down with a lot of this woke kind of. You look at what Lloyd Austin did on day one when he was in when he assumed office. Literally, he had I think it was a 36 or maybe even a 72-hour complete stand down of the military to, quote, root out white extremism in the ranks. And then of course that went on for about that investigation went on for about a year. They basically, I think, we're just giving people, quote, training on that. And then lo and behold, Kirby announced, my successor at the NSC spokesman job, Kirby announced at the end of the process just that, hey, they hadn't found anything after this 1.5 year long sort of witch hunt in the ranks. This is something that really hurts morale. Number one, you guys are both Navy officers, and so if you look at, you can tell me better than I can, but I've just read the reports about the number of U.S. Navy SEALs who decided that they would not take the vaccine, so they were cashiered. I think there was something like 8,000 total Navy personnel, but then there were hundreds of SEAL officers and enlisted guys who were absolutely cashiered, and they said, look, if you don't take the virus, if you don't take the vaccine, then you're gonna be out you're gonna be on the out. So back to your question, Sean, is that I think that the main mission is to say, look, we are about war fighting. We're not about doing these divisive stand downs and everything else. We just need to welcome everybody as Americans and just say we're all part of one team and focus on the mission and not focus on whether it's all these social experiments with sort of diversity training and all this business that really has hurt readiness overall.
Morgan, to me, the interesting thing is, in the last several years, this focus on DEI training, right? I just don't understand what that has to do with warfighting. The military has always been a meritocracy. The people who deserve and who earn the right to move on, to get promoted. But now it's all become about, understanding our culture and our diversity. And again, I'm all for a diverse force, but not at the sake of readiness.
Well, that's exactly right. Diversity is a strength. The United States is the greatest fighting force in the history of the world, we're told over and over. And diversity is a good thing when you have diverse viewpoints. But what they're seeking is diversity in everything but a viewpoint. They want to walk a very tight rope in people's views, and it's toxic, and it drives people out of the military. John's exactly right. We have driven people out of our military. Recruiting in the history of the all-volunteer force. So we've had the all-volunteer force. That is, we haven't had a draft since the 1970s. So for 50 years, the country never missed its recruiting goals. The Army never missed its recruiting goals until Joe Biden. And under this administration, we are short not just a few people, as John mentioned, we are short 2 entire divisions. No one has weakened the United States military like this administration.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's a bunch of factors. One is, it was like in this last election, if you tell white men and billionaires that they're horrible and evil, newsflash, they're not going to vote for you, right? They kind
Right.
of want both ways. If you tell white men that they are toxic and they show toxic masculinity, and that the message that John mentioned about the stand down,
Right.
that the Secretary of Defense initiated. So it said two things. I mean, first, it says to anyone who isn't in the military, gosh, the military must be full of white extremists,
Right.
which couldn't
Unbelievable.
it couldn't be more wrong. I mean, the United States military is the most diverse organization in the nation.
So I'd say,
And two, it tells anybody who's in it, like, it insults them. Oh, I must be a white extremist. So it was a terrible message to put out. And the second thing that I think really tanked recruiting is the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Right.
We'll get to that.
hey, real quick, just on that point, though, just on the personnel point, Morgan's absolutely right. What I'd say, Sean, is that if you look at the number of, I was in the Marine Corps, obviously had had a modest service for just 4 years on active duty right after college. And we were taught on day one, and this was back in the 90s, and they said to us when obviously diversity was as much of an issue as it is now, quote unquote, but they said, hey, it doesn't matter if you're black, white, Latino, you're all green. We're all green Marines, and that's it. And so there was no division of people by saying, hey, we want to look at you in a different way. And so somehow we've gotten away from that. And it's not just somehow, it's under the leadership. Do you remember Milley testified, and he said something about how he wanted that what was the name of that book by some
White
guy?
fragility, right?
Yeah, it was something like that. And just saying how there's white supremacy. And he said, I really want to understand this, because that is something that's a real sentiment out there. Instead of him standing up at that hearing and just saying, hey, once again, we're all green, doesn't matter, then I don't want to force officers to read this total left-wing, divisive DEI. I forget who wrote it. It was some, I forget who the guy was who wrote
Actually, White Fragility was written by a white person, by the way, which is kind of the irony of this, is that anyway. And I'm not sure. Just in case someone's like trying to fact check, it's like I'm not sure that was the book that Milley was referring to, but I think it was. Let me ask you guys both a question though. Do either of you have a history of family service in the military?
Yes.
I mean, yes, my uncle was a Marine as well.
Okay.
But
one of the things that I found amazing, we talked about, you guys both brought up recruitment. When the military started to basically say, look, there's a history of people who have serving. So each of us has family history. And look at this. Wow, we're all have served, right? And so that it seems that you would kind of want to keep that going, right? It seems that makes the most sense. Keep those people. And when they started to demonize that, I was like, why are you guys killing one of the best sources of recruits that you have? And people went to the military. I mean, it was just, they are literally stepping on themselves when it comes to screwing up, bringing people
Not one
in.
up. It is the strongest correlation between service. So it's not race, it's not socioeconomic status, it's not education. It is, do you have a family member who served? That is the strongest correlation that you will serve and put up your hand. It's a family business. Military service is a family business.
But I want to get to procurement and other stuff in a second. But there was a chapter in John's book that, honest to God, John, I mean, how long have we known each other? 10 years?
Yeah, 10 years or more. Absolutely.
10 years or more. I get to page 143, and I put the bookmark there because I was like, and this is how it says. I don't know if you remember your own book, because sometimes I forget mine. It says, as a proud American who happens to be gay, I say it's time to end Gay Pride Month. And I'm like, I didn't even know this.
Yeah,
like,
that's right. Well, yeah, on that note is that that essay, this is a book it's called The Biden-Harris Betrayal, Weak and Woke on the World Stage. Probably no one's going to buy it now because there you go.
No. I loved it because it sets us back to remember where we're off. I actually think even now it's I enjoy it because it's a reminder of how off track we got and what we need to do to course correct. So
on that note,
there's your pitch to buy John's book.
Yeah, well, there you go. Absolutely. And it's available on Amazon, was a bestseller and #1 bestseller in leadership. But anyway, bottom line is that to your point on that essay, what I said in there is that President Trump, to his credit, he didn't care, in naming me to both the VA, where I was an assistant secretary, and the NSC as the senior director for Stratcom. Bottom line is that he never once mentioned that I was gay, because he could have said, hey, this is the first gay spokesman for the National Security Council, etc. Who cares? I mean, that's just
Right. You were the best person for the job.
yeah, exactly. And it would demean me if you were to say that. And so if you look, there's some guy who's head of, I believe it is, I forget what this is for everybody, but this is, I think, some department where there's somebody who is the head of, I think it might be HUD or something, that President Biden named. And in this guy's bio, it says, this person is XYZ, is the head of this department. I don't know if it's HUD, but is head of this department, comma, the first African-American to hold that position. Well, think about how that demeans him, because it says, look, that it implies that but for that this is a barrier breaker, and that he was hired for his race, or hired because he's gay, hired because of anything else. And in that essay of the book, and the book is a collection of 50 essays, but that essay is called It's Time to End Gay Pride Month. And the reasons is, I said, look, that we are all, once again, Americans, and it doesn't matter our characteristics. So this business of flying the gay pride flag, I mean, I looked out, and I have another essay in the book that looked over at the headquarters of my former home there at the VA headquarters there, just opposite the White House. And there was the gay pride flag flying there on Gay Pride Month. And I thought, hey, let's fly the American flag there and not the gay pride flag, because that says to veterans that, hey, we're going to put you in different subgroups, and that's not what we're about. And we need to get back to the fact that we're all Americans in the armed forces. And so one other thing on that, before we go into procurement, which is very important, Sean and Morgan, is that if you look at who's at the top in terms of civilian leadership, we've had Lloyd Austin for 4 years. He went AWOL, I think, for a whole week, where not even his senior staff knew where he was, let alone the White House. And he was out having a medical procedure, but they just didn't tell anybody. And he was never held accountable for that. He was never held accountable, nor were any of the generals in that debacle of pulling out from Afghanistan. So accountability is a cornerstone that's gone out the window. But once again, is that this idea of these generals, these former generals, whether it is Lloyd Austin, or whether it is, Milley had his problems on active duty, but Esper was somebody who came from the private sector. But Mattis before there, if you just look at Mattis and Austin, they are both people who just didn't connect at all with the public that they served, and certainly with the president in the case of Mattis. But bottom line is that it is something where we need to get back to having leadership that is not from this swampy generals rotating in from Raytheon, rotating back out afterward. And it is just something where we need accountability, and we need to look at people. And that's why President Trump's nominee here was a great choice in terms of Pete Hegseth. And that's something where we get away from just this revolving door of general officers in there. So anyway, that's just my view.
Yeah.
Where there is accountability, there's accountability at colonel, captain, and below. So if you're a Navy,
Right.
you're a Navy captain and you crash your vessel into the dock, you're out of there.
Right. Well,
right. But we don't have accountability. General Miller, General McKenzie, no one who was in charge of Afghanistan has had any consequences at all. The greatest debacle since the War of 1812, when they burned down the White House, and there's not one head has rolled.
Well,
Why
no,
do you think that is? Isn't that
Let me-
weird? You like. In fact, didn't a bunch of the folks get awards for that? I mean, I just how do you screw that up and then get promoted?
Well, Morgan hits it right on the head, because not only was no one held accountable there at the general officer, at the leadership level, who are behind Afghanistan. Do you both remember the one person who was held accountable was a Marine lieutenant colonel,
Right,
who was back stateside, and he just issued something on social media. He said, "Why isn't anybody held accountable?" I think he was put in the brig for a week, and then he was cashiered there 2 years before his 20-year service, and so he lost his retirement for asking for accountability, and then they held him accountable as the only one. What
it's
a
a
mess!
two-tiered system, and people, back to your first question, Sean, why aren't people signing up? They see that there's a two-tiered system.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, I want to pivot to the stuff, the procurement, because Morgan, you wrote a piece in the Daily Caller that I thought was interesting, and this is what you said: many of the ships America does have are old, leaking, and rusting. Longtime naval officers know that ships rust and often look rough after long deployments. But the current shoddy state of America's fleet is a direct result of the Biden administration's dumb policy of declaring war on climate change. Are you just going after the climate change focus, or are you saying that we are fundamentally not ready anymore?
I mean, both. Both. I mean, climate change. We heard General Milley declare war on climate change, and the Pentagon has officially said climate change is the greatest military threat to the United States, which is absurd. So, in the case of shipbuilding and ship maintenance, we can't use certain paints because they have lead in them or they have other toxic substances. By the way, those lead paint sticks really well to ships, but we can't use that. And a lot of our shipyard maintenance facilities are on woke coast. They're out in Washington State and California and Hawaii, where there are all kinds of state regulations where you can't have a sailor dangling over the side in a rope to paint anymore. So our ships are in terrible looking shape, but strategically, we have the smallest fleet since 1917. Obama famously said to Mitt Romney that we, have great capabilities in our Navy, and we do have awesome capabilities. But no ship, to my knowledge, has the capability to be in two places at once. And with a battle fleet of less than 300 ships, the Chinese now have a larger fleet than we do.
Right.
And it's all in China. It's all right there in Chinese territorial waters while we're spread out around the globe from everywhere from, Guam to Djibouti.
Right.
And that's a serious threat to the United States.
Well, also, if you look at President Trump, he set out in the last year, in fact, it was the last 3 months when we were at the NSC of his presidency, what he did was he set out that goal, Morgan, remember, of 355 ship Navy to get back up there. And he had a step up so that we could get there by the end of his second term, which obviously is more of a commitment than, to put the funding in there for actual building the ships. But it's absolutely, that was totally abandoned under Biden. And now we're worse off. As you point, we're below 300 ships. This is something where if you look at just what we invested in Ukraine and in arming Ukraine, which was over $200 billion reportedly, is that if you take that, I mean, let's say a Ford class carrier is probably $13 billion to staff that, and everything is probably, call it $40 billion total for a Ford class carrier. That means that we could have had 3 or 4 Ford class carriers built. Well, it would take a while to build them, but that would be the money that we put to Ukraine that we could have invested in our own procurement, our own shipbuilding.
The grim part of it is that we don't have, if we got into a hot war, if the balloon went up with China, I think most Americans would be appalled to know, and this is public, I'm not saying anything is classified, that we would go Winchester in less than 2 weeks. And going Winchester is the military term for running out of ammo.
Right.
Well, I was going to ask you, Morgan, I know that when you worked for Tommy Tuberville, there was a lot of concern about munitions that are built in Alabama, and we're sending stuff to Ukraine. And frankly, I mean, I'll let you answer the question. How prepared are we? What is our capability to build back up the necessary means, munition-wise, ship-wise, et cetera?
We're not ready.
But
and
why is no one not sounding the alarm? Do you understand?
This administration
I don't get
broken
that.
The law. They've broken the law. The law says we have to have 30 days worth of ammo. That's what the law says. That's what Congress has mandated. And this administration is well below those 30-day reserves. If you go to the Congressional Research Service and just Google it, Google what's been sent to Ukraine. Congressional Research Service has the official numbers. And what they'll say, they'll list the munition by type. So they'll say Stinger missile or Patriot missile, whatever. And then it'll give the figure. So under javelins, which we all saw how effective javelins were in Ukraine, it said 6,000 plus. That little plus sign is what you should pay attention to, because that's their way of trying to keep it classified that of our 12,000 or 14,000, however many we have, they don't want to say that we're edging up to that border where we're running out. And we're running out. And it takes a long time. It took us 20 years to make all of those. It takes a long time to make a javelin. We haven't made a Stinger in this country since I think 2002. So it will take a while to rebuild those stocks, and we don't have.
John, why isn't someone ringing the bell, and saying exactly what Morgan's saying? Okay, guys, we got to rebuild this stuff. We're not ready. We got to get it, because China is saying, "Hey, be ready by 2027 because we're coming for you." Right. And I feel like, to Morgan's point, we're going to open up the door and go, "Oh, guess what? There's no munitions.
Nothing there." Well, do you remember, this is outrageous just on a double point. It goes to your question, but also, do you remember how it was literally 10 days before the election when Zelensky was in town and he met with Kamala, and then they went up to some place in it was a munitions manufacturer
Pennsylvania.
up in Pennsylvania, exactly. And they had nothing but Democrats around there, and they were fighting a Senate race there as well as the presidential race swing state. And they were actually, Zelensky was signing I guess the 200-pound bombs or 50-pound bombs that were there that were going to then go over to Ukraine. I mean, it's making it's a political statement where he was essentially at a campaign event for them about what money they would be bringing into Pennsylvania by spending money in Ukraine. But the second idea is exactly to Morgan's point, is that why aren't those munitions going to that we can buy munitions and still keep jobs in Pennsylvania, but have them, number one, for our defense and not for sending those out and just basically being a cash cow for the U.S. industry while not really making us any stronger ourselves. Our industry here is some of the best. It is the best in the world, but we need to spend it, number one, on ourselves before we even start thinking about arming any allies, or even in a situation like Ukraine where they're not direct allies of ours, at least not in NATO.
A lot of talking heads in Washington talk about the defense industrial base as if you can somehow separate the defense industrial base from our commercial industrial base. And you can't. Those things are inseparable. And America's industrial base is in shoddy state because we've made it a policy of the United States to become a service-based economy, to become a knowledge-based economy. And I mean, that's been the policy of the United States for 40 years. And what happens when you suddenly want to, the CHIPS Act passed, we wanted to put semiconductors, build a semiconductor plant in Arizona so that maybe all of our chips weren't being made in Taiwan. And Taiwan Semiconductor came over to construct that plant, and they couldn't because there weren't enough welders.
Right.
Same thing with Apple they were trying to build a Pro line in Texas, and they couldn't do it because they couldn't source enough screws, of all things. That is a dangerous state to be in. We've given up the little technologies thinking, oh, it's all right if, China makes all of our shower curtain rings. It's all right if they make all of our chromium and titanium. And suddenly, 100 critical minerals we're dependent on our adversary for. It's not like we can shoot all of ours and then say, hey, can we have some more rare earths so that we can shoot them back at you?
Right. 100%.
So what's the answer? I mean, it sounds to me like we're in a very precarious state right now that if China were to follow through either in attacking Taiwan, trying to reclaim Taiwan, or coming after us, that we're in a very precarious situation. So what's the answer, John? What is maybe the first priority that Trump needs to institute to ensure that we send a strong signal to them? Is it tough talk? Is it spending money building ships or munitions?
Well, I think it's, the tough talk is just that if you're not backed up by a capability, to Morgan's point. So look, everybody knows where President Trump stands. He's not for endless wars. He's somebody he called right now. He said we should have a ceasefire immediately, even before he's in office, in Ukraine, and then just not even just ramp it down, but just stop the war there, have a negotiated settlement. That's something that was on the table two and a half years ago. When Biden was right after they crossed the LOD, the Russians did there. What happened was there was a deal on the table in Turkey. You guys probably remember that, where it was going to be, okay, Ukraine's going to give away the Crimean Peninsula. They're going to give away maybe Donbass, which was already occupied by the Russians before they're encouraging toward Kiev. And that was on the table. And Boris Johnson flew in there. And he said, no, wait a minute. We're going to arm you, et cetera. And here it is 2 years later, more than 2 years later, where you have this meat grinder in there that we're paying for ourselves in terms of both our dollars as well as our readiness that Morgan pointed out. And so, number one, he's going to ramp down the war there. Number two, get back to the shipbuilding that Morgan so eloquently talked about, not only on the building, but on the maintenance side. And then number three, what I would say is something that we could do a whole program on this, but if you look at what's happening in drone capability right now, is that our ships you can have very cheap drones that are just in a cluster that are fired at one of our ships. If you have 6,000 drones just coming over toward a Ford-class carrier, there's a real vulnerability there. And we could be building up that capability and learning a lot from what's happened on the front lines right now, looking at what the Israelis are doing, and frankly, looking at what's happened in the Ukraine war, where drone warfare is a real part of that. And there's a lot, I know we're doing a lot in terms of research on that front, but rather than spending, let's say, another billions of dollars on different ships, we should do that as well. But we should also think about there's a cheap way to have a big capability both on the seas and on land.
Boy, Doge could really help a lot in the Pentagon and procurement. There's a drone company I'm friends with, it's in Ukraine, and they've gotten the cost per drone down to $500, and they can make 1,000 a day for $500 a pop. And that's a great lesson learned from Ukraine. The United States and Afghanistan and Iraq were spending, we had a M9, $20 million drone shooting a $500,000 Hellfire missile backed up by 12 people at the Pentagon approving it, 2 guys in North Dakota flying it. And it all cost about $6 million to kill some teenager on a moped with $20 worth of, kitchen chemicals.
Exactly.
His back.
Can I ask you guys one last question?
Prosecute a war.
One last thing I want to get to. There's a lot of talk by people who want to secure the border, myself included, about what capabilities we can bring to the fight. And a lot of people say that we should use the U.S. military to go after the cartels. I just briefly, can you guys, is that a realistic option for us?
Let me just jump in there real quick, and then be very interested in Morgan's view on this. But so when I was a young lieutenant, I actually served on the border as part of what's called Joint Task Force 6, where we went down we had a Marine battalion, 2nd Recon Battalion, that went down on the border on the Arizona Mexican border. And what we did was, because of posse comitatus, we were not able to actually apprehend and have the military, and maybe there's reforms that could be made there. But what our mission was there is that we were actually co-located in the border patrol stations along that southeast border of Arizona and Mexico. And what we did is we'd have recon units in the field, eyes and ears out there that the border patrol didn't have, to be able to say, okay, hey, these guys are crossing at this location. And then back then there was no wall whatsoever. But in other words, you can have capability, and I have an essay about this in the book. You can have deployment on the border even without an apprehension. That would really be eyes and ears. That would be very welcomed by the Border Patrol. But guess what Biden did? So he put the National Guard. He put 1,500 National Guards men and women down on the border, quote unquote. And guess what they were doing? They were put in a warehouse where they were processing paperwork on letting immigrants in. They didn't put them down doing their job. Instead, they were processing paperwork there. It's just an absolute disgrace. But anyway, we should be able to have that capability, but there's a limit to what we can do by way of apprehension just because of posse comitatus.
Going after the cartels is exactly what our military is designed to do. It dates back to Jefferson and the Barbary Pirates. This is exactly the mission of the United States military, is to go after threats to the United States, whether they are state actors or, in some cases, these cartels are larger. They have larger militaries than the countries they're occupying.
Right.
They've been funded. If you think about all of the coyotes that have charged $5,000 a pop to bring an immigrant over our border illegally, when you add up, 10 million immigrants, this is an incredible amount of money that has gone to these cartels. They have capabilities that most countries in Latin America can't match, and the United States military can.
Well, one thing we could do, Morgan, that's a great point, is that what we could do is just enter into an agreement with Mexico. You wouldn't want to do it without an agreement, but if there were a combined operation that was Mexican with U.S. support to actually go after the cartels in Mexico and degrade their capabilities, I think that they would be in a hurt box in about 36 hours if there were a coordinated capability where we'd have U.S. munitions and U.S. attacks there against the cartel forces. I think they'd be crying uncle within about 36 hours because they're right now just they know that there's nobody, they have no threat that they're facing. And so that's why, and if you look at the damage that they've done in terms of all the people they put across the border and the mayhem they have in our cities right now, it's just a disgrace.
Yeah.
We should
they are a direct threat to the sovereignty and the health of this nation. And it is, we talk about how Ukraine affects Americans. We can talk about how Taiwan affects Americans, but the cartels are directly affecting and killing hundreds of thousands of Americans.
Yeah. Gentlemen, I'm going to have to leave it there. John, once again, if you want a good read right now to understand why we need to reset, check out the Biden-Harris Betrayal, John's book. Morgan's always writing, Daily Caller, other places. check out his work at America First Policy Institute. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. Happy New Year.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Morgan.
Thanks, Sean. Good talking to you, Sean.
Good to see you. Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.